This is a formality, but let me briefly introduce all the discussants, all the presenter and discussants. I am Professor Byung-Kwan Son, who is teaching American politics at Department of Political Science and International Relations at Chung-Ang University, Seoul. Nice to see you all. And we have Professor Mark Rosell, who is Dean of Schar School of Public Policy and Government, and I think he's an authority on presidential study. And he belongs to George Mason University, and he's had several publications, including highly acclaimed book, The Unitary Executive and Executive Privilege, etc. And we have the American discussant, Professor Clyde Wilcox. He's a professor in Government Department in Georgetown University. I think he's an American and comparative politics specialist, and he wrote several books with Mark Rosell, the Federalism, and with Jeffrey Berry, the Interest Group Society, etc. And he wrote several other important articles here and there in prestigious American scholarly policy journals. And we have Korean discussant whose name is Jung-Gun Seo, Professor Seo, who is working at the Department of Political Science in Kyunghee University, Seoul, Korea. He is teaching American politics, US foreign policy, and party and legislative politics. And he has recently published a book in Korean, which is highly acclaimed in Korean, American politics specialist, whose title is When American Politics Meeting International Relations. And he also publishes several articles here and there, like, Political Science Quarterly, American Politics Research, etc. Okay, that's about it, about the, brief introduction of the presenter and discussants. And the sequence is like this. I will give Professor Rosell for presentation about 25 minutes. And we will first hear from American discussant, Professor Wilcox, about 15 minutes of discussion, and again, another 15 minutes from Professor Jung-Gun Seo, okay? And, and then we will hear again from Professor Mark Rosell as an occasion to respond to the comments given by two discussants. And then we'd like to have a free discussion during the remaining time from other audiences who might be joining this session, but I think they are not yet in. Okay, that's about it for the brief introduction. And first, we will listen from Professor Mark Rosell on, U.S. presidential election, 2016 and 2012. Would you please go ahead?
Great, thank you. Yep. Yeah, thank you. Delighted to do this. So what I want to do is provide an overview of not only what happened in 2016, but try to project likely scenarios for the 2020 election cycle. To understand the 2020 cycle, it's very important to have the context of what happened in the latest presidential election in 2016. So let me, here we go. Yeah, my clicker wasn't working, so I'm just going to do it a different way. So as we all know, the election is on November 3rd. And in the United States, we don't do our presidential elections by national popular vote, but rather through this unusual system called the Electoral College that was really a compromise at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when the delegates were debating various scenarios for how the United States would pick its presidents. For reasons of federalism and many of the small states not wanting to be effectively shut out of the presidential election process, they feared that the large population states would dominate presidential selection if we had a popular vote-based system. The delegates settled upon the idea of this electoral college in which candidates run for the presidency not to win popular votes nationally, but to win states. So this is a winner-take-all system, state by state. In effect, we have 51 separate elections for the presidency, the 50 states and the District of Columbia. States, by the way, are allowed to choose how they distribute their electors if they want to change the formula away from winner-take-all. 2 states have done this, Nebraska and Maine. They split their electoral votes in part by congressional districts. Candidate who wins the popular vote in a congressional district gets that one elector, rather than doing a winner-take-all system. But in 48 states and the District of Columbia, it's a winner-take-all system. So that is why twice in the past 2 decades, the candidate who won the popular vote lost the presidential election, Al Gore in 2000, and Hillary Clinton, who won about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, lost the election in 2016. Under the original concept of the Electoral College, the electors have discretion to defect from the popular vote of their state, but this happens extremely rarely. These are called faithless electors. There was a movement after the 2016 election among some progressive activists to try to convince electors to the Electoral College to break with the popular vote of their states in order to avoid Donald Trump from becoming president. That never had any realistic chance of actually happening. Now, the math, very simple. The candidate who gets a majority of the electors to the Electoral College wins the presidency. 270 is the magic number. There are 538 electors to the Electoral College. Let me just explain very quickly how we arrived at that number. The number of electors from each state is equal to the number of House of Representatives districts plus 2. So it's equal to the number of members of Congress serving in the national government, both House of Representatives and the Senate. This was a constitutional compromise that gave something of a boost to the smaller population states. So, for example, you see California has 55 electors. California has 53 House of Representatives districts, and then it gets the boost of 2 for the Electoral College. But if you go one state over to Nevada with a very small population, they have only 4 congressional districts, House of Representatives, and those are based on population size strictly. But they get 6 electors. So in the smaller population states, the number of electors is slightly out of proportion or in their favor in relationship to their population size. That gives some statistical boost today to Republican candidates because Republicans tend to win smaller population rural states that again have smaller numbers of electors, but they get the same statistical boost of 2 additional electors as do the large population centers states in the country. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little time on this one to explain what happened in 2016 and why that is important for the upcoming election. Looking at this map here, the red states are the Republican states, the blue states are the Democratic states going into year 2016. All of the red states here are those that in the previous 6 presidential election cycles had gone Republican either 5 or all 6 times. The blue states are the states that had gone Democratic either all 6 times or 5 out of 6 times. So you recall that all the analysts said that there was no chance that Hillary Clinton would lose the presidency. And looking at this map, it's very easy to understand. If Hillary Clinton merely holds the reliable Democratic Party voting states, she has 257 automatically out of 270 that are needed, meaning that she only needs 13 more electors to win the presidency. Now, the state of Virginia, where I teach at George Mason University, 13 electors. In the middle of the summer of 2016, Donald Trump fired his campaign manager in Virginia and pulled his entire election team out of the state. He conceded the state. He knew he had no chance of winning it. So the white states here are what we called the swing states, right? The states that did not go solidly either Democrat or Republican in the previous 6 presidential election cycles. And Virginia was one of those states. But because of demographic and political shifts that happened rather rapidly in Virginia, it had become effectively a solid blue state. in time for the 2016 election cycle. So the analysts looking at the electoral map for the Electoral College said, there's no way that Hillary Clinton can lose. All she has to do is hold the reliable Democratic Party voting states, and Virginia is automatic. There's no chance that she can lose. So that's why people were looking at the electoral map back in 2016 and saying that there really was very little to no chance that Donald Trump could win the presidency. So this is what they called the blue wall. You know, the heavily Democratic Party leaning states that were simply impenetrable by a Republican, that made it impossible for a Republican to win unless the Republican, as we say, runs the board, wins all the remaining states, the swing states, in order to get 270 or more electoral votes. So Donald Trump's strategy is to break the blue wall and try to find some place in this electoral map where he can take votes away from Hillary Clinton and effectively break the blue wall, that is, win some Democratic Party leaning states. And this is where Mr. Trump's appeal in the 2016 election cycle to voters in the manufacturing sectors of the economy that had declined significantly since globalization, right? Many people, devastated communities had lost their livelihoods. And Donald Trump made a very concerted effort in focusing on, for example, trade issues, the perception that the United States had not done well in its trade negotiations with other nation states, had been taken advantage of in trade negotiations. And Mr. Trump largely was blaming the decline of sectors of the American economy, particularly focused in the Midwest and upper Midwest states, typically Democratic Party voting states, on the policies of the Obama administration and Democratic administrations that had neglected to pay attention to those voters and neglected to pay attention to their dilemmas, their plights economically. So Trump was able to effectively break the blue wall by presenting himself as a very different kind of Republican. Republicans in the United States traditionally have been in favor of free trade. And Mr. Trump had a kind of populist appeal among a core of voters who typically had voted Democratic. Many of these labor union households, for example, lower income, lower to middle income, working class, as we say, voters, who, again, traditionally for many years had been Democratic Party voters. And Trump was able to effectively break the blue wall by attracting those votes. And what all the analysts acknowledge now was the huge strategic mistake by Hillary Clinton in 2016 was not focusing her campaign effort on those reliably blue states, particularly late in the campaign. So famously, people have pointed out she never even visited the state of Wisconsin, just assumed that was an automatic lock for the Democratic Party nominee. And Donald Trump ends up winning Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Hillary Clinton, late in the campaign, was spending a lot of her time campaigning in reliable red voting states, effectively trying to run up a huge electoral college majority, assuming that she was going to win the election. She was trying to win some additional states to win an even bigger mandate. And so nobody expected that particular outcome. So let me turn to the electoral map then for 2020. And here I'm going to do very similar to what I put on the board for 2016, which is to build in certain assumptions based on recent voting patterns. Now, looking at this, you would say, wow, that looks really good for Mr. Trump right now. This electoral map can change over time. Looking at some of the polling data right now, some of the polls are not quite as optimistic as this map shows for Mr. Trump. But other polls are showing that actually this is very accurately reflective of where we stand right now. So if Mr. Trump is to hold the reliable Republican voting areas, he's pretty close to 270 right now. But let me point out, I've got red and shades of red, and I've got blue and shades of blue here, different than the previous map. So the lighter blue states, Nevada, Colorado, Minnesota, those are states that are not absolutely solid blue, we believe, in this election cycle. Possibly they could swing to the Republican side, but they're probably more likely to stay Democratic. And the kind of pinkish states, I meant to be a softer red there, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona, they are not solid Republican bloc states. They're leaning Republican. So those are possible pickups for the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, in this election cycle. But the key point I'm trying to make here is that, even though the Democrats had won some of the so-called swing states in the latest election cycle, Colorado and Virginia, and they're likely to do so again, they lost because he made that breakthrough in the upper Midwest states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those look to be, those gold states, the key to the outcome of the presidential election in year 2020. Now, again, looking at the winner-take-all system here, this really shows the polarization of the American electorate in a very stark way. About 80% of the states are solidly either Democrat or Republican leaning. The election, it looks like, is going to be fought at most in 10 states out of 50. So if you take the light blue and the light red, and then the three critical states, the gold states, you only have 10 states that look to be competitive in the Electoral College. And then the two odd states there that have stripes are Nebraska and Maine, where I told you they don't do the winner-take-all system. So Joe Biden either has to win all of the three Great Lakes states in the upper Midwest, or he has to swap them with some of the weak Republican states, the kind of pinkish or light red hue states, which I think would be extremely hard for him to do. Okay, and then Trump, of course, has to defend those pink states and then pick up really just one of the Great Lakes states if he can defend all of his Republican territory, including the states that are merely leaning Republican but not certain to vote Republican in the next election cycle. So quickly, the anatomy of a Trump victory. He holds Florida, okay, his new home state now. He moved from New York, changed his residency to Florida. Here's a potential problem, though, for Donald Trump. And, I think our discussion should talk, we should talk a bit about, what's going on now with the virus spread and how that's affecting Trump's standing with the electorate. In the latest public opinion polls, there are two really critical groups to the election outcome that are showing some breakaway from Mr. Trump, and I think will be critical to the election outcome. One is older voters. So the state of Florida, which went Republican in 2016, and Trump needs to keep that state this year, has a very high percentage of retirees, people living on fixed incomes, older Americans. It's a very popular state for people who retire to move there. It's a very low tax state, no income tax state, for example. So older people on fixed incomes, warm weather. Florida's a very popular place for old people. Old people are very vulnerable to this virus spread. And some of the polling data now showing where most Americans believe the president has not done a good job of managing this crisis. And the most vulnerable population, the older people, they're starting to slip away a bit in their support for Mr. Trump. So that's something to watch out for. There's another group, and those are the people who say they don't like either party's candidate. They hate them both. They're really dissatisfied with the choice that they have between the two major political parties. In 2016, the people who said in the polls that they intensely dislike both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, they broke on election day strongly for Mr. Trump. So they disliked Mrs. Clinton more than they disliked Trump, I guess. Right now, the polling data are showing that that segment of the voting population, the people who say, I don't like Biden and I don't like Trump, I hate them both, when forced to choose between the two, they're breaking for Biden. So those are two very important groups to look for. Okay, so as I pointed out, the president is effectively president of the swing states. So American presidential elections now with political polarization tend to focus on a relatively small number of states in the Electoral College. And so if you live in California, New York, Maryland, where I live, Virginia, states that are solidly either Democrat or Republican leaning, you're not going to see a lot of campaign advertising, candidate visits, and the like. The candidates are going to put their entire focus on the states where they think that they can make a difference to the outcome. Okay, the political parties today, the parties traditionally have been coalitions of left, right, liberal, conservative positions. For the first 150 years of our nation's history, key issues were slavery, tariffs, monetary policy. In the 1960s, divisions started to change significantly. The Republican Party became the small government party. In other words, they respected federalism, focusing more power on local and state governments, shrinking the federal government. And the Republican Party became a faction of business interests, libertarians, and then eventually social conservatives and even nativists. But Donald Trump, again, is a very different kind of Republican. He was able to break into some traditional Democratic voting constituencies in 2016. His position on trade policy is profoundly different than the traditional Republican Party of my lifetime. And so I refer to the different factions of the Republican Party now as junior coalition parties to a personalized and nationalized element of the electorate that really just follows Mr. Trump. Some people say it's almost a cult-like following. Maybe that's a little bit extreme, but the kind of personality, effect is quite extraordinary. That's driving much of the support for Mr. Trump that goes beyond ideology and it goes beyond the traditional coalitions of the Republican Party. Okay, and so that's important because today more people, when forced to choose between Democrat and Republican in polls, say that they lean Democratic. Recent election cycles, particularly the 2018 midterm elections, went heavily to the Democratic Party. So that may be suggestive of where the election is going. But there are some other factors that we have to take into account as well. But first, one of the very significant changes in my lifetime in voting patterns in the United States is the cultural and economic split among voters. Higher income voters, people with high levels of education, have moved significantly toward the Democratic Party in ways that when I first studied political science in graduate school, the conventional wisdom was that with higher education, higher income, you're more likely to have Republican voting. And working class people, lower educated, were heavily Democrats. And this has shifted dramatically, where now among postgraduates, the Democrats have a 2-to-1 advantage over Republicans right now. But again, just a generation ago, it was almost completely the opposite. Okay, parties differ by ideology and demographics. So here you see the Republican Party is really the white party of America. Republican Party is 90% non-Hispanic whites. The Democratic Party is about 70% white. But the demographic portions of our population that are growing in size the fastest, of course, are the minority populations, and they lean heavily Democratic. So many analysts are saying that the future of the Democratic Party looks really good as the country diversifies. More people are identifying as Democrats, and maybe Mr. Trump represents the last stand of a kind of overly white-dominated Republican Party that if the Republican Party in the future wants to maintain relevancy and be competitive, it's not going to be able to follow the path of Mr. Trump, focusing on nativist elements, anti-immigration, and other policy positions that are deeply offensive to many minority Americans. Okay, so again, this is pretty much saying the same thing. Let me give you an interesting statistic here, just to show how much the electorate has changed in the United States. And my time is getting close, so I'll finish up quickly. In 1984, Ronald Reagan won 56% of the white vote. He won 49 out of 50 states. The next election cycle, 1988, George H.W. Bush won 59% of the white vote. He won 44 states, a huge electoral landslide. In 2012, Mitt Romney also won 59% of the white vote. He lost the election overwhelmingly to Barack Obama. So that's a really interesting, telling statistic about the demographic changes that have taken place in the United States. Many analysts in 2016 had predicted that there would be a very significant Latino surge because of some of Mr. Trump's positions on immigration issues, some deeply offensive comments he had made about Mexican immigrants, for example, would spur a massive surge or increase in Latino voting in 2016. It did not happen. Actually, Latino voting went down somewhat from what it had been in 2012, and it actually moved slightly more Republican than it had been in 2012. So many are saying that's also a critical element to the election outcome in 2020. Now that Mr. Trump has been president for several years and Latino voters have seen the consequences of some of his policies, now analysts are saying that populations that did not turn out in large numbers, minority populations, Latinos, also African Americans, were likely to see a significant upswing in 2020. Okay, so even given the demographic changes in the United States, why does the Republican Party remain competitive, given what I just told you about the white component of the electorate not being enough to win? Democratic voters are concentrated in high population areas. We say that a lot of votes are wasted in New York and California. Remember, the Electoral College is winner take all. The candidate who wins the most votes wins 100% of the electors in the Electoral College from that state. Hillary Clinton ran up huge popular majorities in big population states such as California and New York. She only needed to win each state by one vote in order to get 100% of the electors. So the distribution of votes nationally gives some statistical advantage to Republicans because the Democrats are heavily concentrated in high population urban areas. So I have joked before that the easy solution for the Democrats with regard to our Electoral College is to convince about 1/4 of the population of California to move into other states. If they did that, they could change the entire competitive component of the Electoral College and win some more states because they're wasting their votes in California. And also Republicans tend to turn out a little better than Democrats do as a percentage of their populations. That's just been a trend for many years. That might change again in this election cycle because of anti-Trump intensity among many Democratic voters right now. Okay. Yeah. Trump changed the electoral map, remember, as I said, in 2016. Is he able to do that in 2020? Perceptions of his failed leadership and the coronavirus spread, I think, are going to play very, very heavily in this election cycle. Some of the scandals of the Trump administration, of course, the impeachment, the intensity factor, and again, the latest polls showing slippage among some older voters and swing voters in the electorate. Okay, I raised the question whether there could be a spoiler candidate. There is one former Republican member of Congress who left the Republican Party who's running for the presidency as a libertarian candidate, a third party. Third party candidates can be spoilers. in American presidential elections. They don't win elections, but they can siphon votes away from one candidate or the other. So I don't think Clyde will disagree with this. Most of us are convinced that in the year 2000, at least, a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, siphoned enough votes away from Al Gore in the state of Florida to have switched the election ultimately to George W. Bush. Many people believe that independent candidate Ross Perot in 1992, who got 19% of the vote as a third-party candidate, took away a significant number of votes from George H.W. Bush and helped swing the election to Bill Clinton, who won the presidency with only 43% of the popular vote. So some people are wondering whether a third-party candidate could make a difference in this election cycle. That is something to look out for. Now, the most unlikely scenario, by the way, is a third-party candidate who actually wins the popular vote of some states. If that were to happen, it is possible that neither presidential candidate will win a majority of the Electoral College. Neither will get at least 270 electors. That creates a really unusual scenario. If that were to happen, under our Constitution, the election goes to the House of Representatives, and the members of the House of Representatives then vote for who the president should be among the top 3 vote getters in the Electoral College. Now, one would think that that means the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, wins because the Democrats are the majority party in the House of Representatives. But actually, under our Constitution, each House of Representatives delegation from each state votes as a unit. So they're voting by states, not by the total number of members of the House of Representatives. Even though the Democrats have a majority of members of the House of Representatives, the Republicans have a majority of members of the House in 26 out of 50 states. And so actually, if the election went to the House of Representatives, if neither candidate got a majority in the Electoral College, Donald Trump would be reelected, most likely, unless there were Republican defections, which I don't think would happen. And by the way, there's one other scenario I didn't point out. I think we need an odd number of electors. That needs to be fixed. We have an even number of electors. I can draw various scenarios that would create a 269-269 outcome, an exact tie in the Electoral College. It is not out of the question that that could happen in this election cycle. And if there were a tie in the Electoral College, again, it goes to the House of Representatives and the Republicans have the advantage. So that is my overview. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your detailed and comprehensive, picture of the whole U.S. presidential election. And, we have much time to delay, so we will go directly to first U.S. discussant, Professor Clyde Wilcox. As an American citizen, this whole picture should be familiar to you, so you may feel free to add your comments or explain your own version. Give us your own version of U.S. presidential election, whatever. Thank you.
Thank
Go ahead.
I'm going to share my screen with a quick PowerPoint. So let's see where it is. There. So Mark, I agree with pretty much everything Mark has said. I'm just going to give it a slightly different take on it. So first of all, primary elections and general elections are very different. Primary elections are very difficult to predict at the beginning of the cycle because of chaos theory. And chaos theory, as you know, doesn't say that the world is unpredictable. It merely says that the starting conditions matter, right? So why can't we predict complicated weather patterns? Because many, many starting conditions vary slightly. So in primaries, it's hard to say who will win because there are chaotic factors of who chooses to run. If Barack Obama had not chosen to run when he first ran, Hillary Clinton would have won that presidency, I think. Which states vote first? Iowa and New Hampshire, very unusual states, using what rules? But general elections are generally predictable. And we can come up with abstract economic models that simply plug in a number of variables and they predict pretty well the outcome of the popular vote. So one of the factors is the popularity of the president. Another is the state of the economy. These are typically measured different ways in different models: per capita GDP growth, unemployment, inflation, number of deaths in war. There's another variable I'm not including because it doesn't apply, but after 8 years of one party in power, there's kind of like an itch to change parties. So very seldom, only once in my lifetime, has the same party retained control of the presidency for 3 consecutive elections. But Trump has only been in 1 term. Now, the models usually predict the popular vote, not necessarily the electoral vote. So in 2016, the model said that Clinton would win by about 3% of the popular vote, and that's actually what she did. So the model predicted the popular vote very well. Now, why was Hillary Clinton doing this silly thing of campaigning in the red states? Because about a week and a half before the election, she was up by 12 points. And here's one thing we know: if a candidate opens up a big lead, a rising tide lifts all boats. Some of those states that look solidly red will become pink. Some of those states that become pink will become light blue. Some of those states that are light blue will become solid blue. What happened was the FBI reopened an investigation into her email. I looked around, there was a word map of the media coverage in the last week of the election, and email is like the biggest word by a mile. That's what everyone focused on. Her lead dropped from 12 to 2, then back to 3. Suddenly those blue wall states turned to Trump, right? So in close elections, this doesn't predict a popular vote, electoral college outcome, but if a rising tide, if a candidate gets a big lead, then May polls about who's ahead in May are not a very good predictor. So let's look at those predicting factors. So first of all, popularity of the incumbent president. And this is from 538.com, and they do a weighted average of polls depending on how accurate they have proven to be in predicting elections. And you can see that Trump had a little surge here when the coronavirus first hit, and he was saying he was the wartime president, and his disapproval rating actually dropped to 50, but he's back down to about 43% here, approval. So that's not good for Trump. It's worth noting here that Trump very seldom goes below 40. That seems to be his floor. These are the people that if Trump shot them on Fifth Avenue, their dying words would be, "Nice shot, Mr. President." But he's really never gotten to 50, ever, right? So his popularity is a drag on his chances. And then the economy is in free fall, right? So this is the weekly unemployment claims. And you can see through 2016 through the beginning of 2020, practically a straight line. And then 33 million, we're actually up to 38 million now, total unemployment claims in the last 8-9 weeks. The per capita GDP is falling, unemployment rate is skyrocketing. So by any measure, the economy is not strong. So you've got an unpopular president with a bad economy. Now, the third factor people have is deaths in war, and we don't have a lot of deaths in war. But if we're having a war on a virus, then we have a lot of deaths, almost twice as many already as we've had in Vietnam. The official total isn't yet 100,000, but there's many people. If you can calculate the unexpectedly high number of deaths in some cities, then we realize that some people are dying of the virus at home, and they're not making it to the hospital. In America, you can't just go to the hospital if you don't have good insurance. Some people don't have insurance. Some people aren't sure their insurance will cover it. And so this is like a bad war, right? This is like trying to defend a war that's very unpopular because no one thinks that the virus is a good thing. And Trump here has a very bad record. There are ads out there that are already being developed where he says it's a hoax, it will magically go away in April. And so now It's a little uncertain here, though, because many states are opening up, and so we don't know what will happen when they open up. Public health officials tell us we're going to get a surge in cases, but it's the summer. If that doesn't happen, then maybe Trump can spin this a little bit. He's certainly going to want to try to blame Democratic governors for the economy, but the virus is pretty much his to deal with. So in a normal election, I would count more on these structural factors than I would state-by-state polls in May. Mark's certainly right that many of those solidly red states would be red no matter what Trump did, but some of them will turn to competitive if he's far behind, and some of them, the swing states will not be swing. But it might not be a normal election. And so many of us who are concerned with democratic theory, lots of people who are concerned with democratic theory, are really nervous about this particular election. In the last election, and especially in 2018, we had a lot of vote suppression. We had a lot of people purged from the rolls, and they were purged from the rolls disproportionately in Black neighborhoods. They mail out a little postcard, but in America, we get a lot of mail. And if you don't respond to this postcard, then you're purged from the rolls. So we see in Georgia, there were large numbers purged, in Wisconsin, in Florida. But this is even worse, I think, in many ways, because what if the virus is back in the fall and say the state of Georgia and Florida say it's not safe to vote? Well, then what would happen? Well, what the Constitution says is state legislatures choose the electors. And so if the governor declares an emergency, that varies by state as to whether they can actually declare an emergency and what they can do. But southern state governors have a lot of power. In any close state, there's going to be challenges. Trump claims that he won by 3 million votes because lots of Mexicans crossed the border to vote. You know, wrong, but many people believed it, right? Surveys showed that 70% of Republicans believed it. So he's going to say, if he loses these close states, that it was because of fraud. He may refuse to accept the outcome. If he loses and he says, no, it was all fraud, then we're really in an ugly place, right? And there may very well be armed vigilantes at the polls. We've seen some of the pictures of this in America already. Just yesterday, there were armed vigilantes in the Michigan legislature carrying Barbie dolls with nooses around their neck, making death threats against the governor. So the real question I have, I think if it's a normal election, nothing changes. I think the Democrats probably win this election. But will we have a fair election, or maybe even have an election at all? Jared Kushner has now twice raised the thought of delaying the election. Presidents can't do that. That has to be Congress. I certainly think Congress would not go along because the House would not go along. Trump has been arguing that mail-in ballots should not count. He's appointed one of his most loyal supporters as head of the post office. So if ballots are being mailed in, am I confident that bags of ballots are not going to go missing? Not entirely. And then there've been some really interesting investigative work recently that says that Russia is again busy hacking state election boards. We know for a fact that they hacked into 13 states last time, and we think they didn't change anything. They were just doing a trial run. But many of these states, vote counting mechanisms don't print paper ballots, and so it's really hard to check. And so for me, the most important fear about this election is just the chaos that might come as the election gets close. Trump has a really strong incentive to try to win this election, because if he loses the election, then the power to investigate past crimes falls to the Justice Department that is not headed by Barr. It's headed by someone who might do, a fair investigation, possibly a biased Democratic investigation, but he certainly would not want that. And so my takeaway is if we have a fair election, the most likely outcome at this point is the Democratic candidate wins, but I'm not 100% sure that it's actually going to be fair. So let me see how I stop sharing the screen here.
Okay, thank you. Is that all?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. And, we'll turn to Korean discussion, presentation by Professor Jung Gun-seo.
Okay, like I said, I'm Jung Kun-seo at Kyunghee University in Seoul, Korea, and I'm so my job as a discussant, I believe, is to raise some interesting discussion points as well. And before I get started, let me just say that I spent my sabbatical year last year in Washington, D.C. as a Fulbright Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I wish I had a chance to visit George Mason or Georgetown and meet with you guys last year, but maybe next time. I will do some follow-up questions for Dean Roselle. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think, it's not like I have any objections to whatsoever. I believe that you have touched upon almost every single important element of the U.S. presidential election, and I really enjoyed it. And I have some sort of a follow-up questions. You talked about the faithless electors as a very important sort of development in the electoral college system in the United States. And I have noticed that there is some very interesting U.S. Supreme Court case going on about the faithless electors. Like the argument is about whether the state has the power to punish those faithless electors if they are not binded by their promises to go for someone, right? So I'm just curious about what's going on in Washington, D.C. And second point is that you also mentioned about Republican Party's factions, nativist and pro-business groups and traditional GOP factions. So everybody is curious about whether GOP is now Trump's party. And what's more interesting and what's more important, seems to me, is whether the GOP is Trump's party even after Trump is gone. So how much change has been already made by President Trump, and what kind of changes is going to persist with Trump gone, either in 2021 or 2025 January. And the third point is about the possibility of 2020 election as a referendum election or a choice election. So traditionally, if the incumbent president is running, it used to be a referendum election, right? Like retrospective voting. What about the past 4 years? If he has done a great job, he's going to be reelected again, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look back at the elections of 1996, Bill Clinton versus Bob Dole, 2004, George W. Bush versus John Kerry, 2012, Obama versus Romney, we could say that those three elections are not necessarily referendum elections, but choice elections. Maybe you don't necessarily agree with me on everything I did over the past 4 years, but look at the other candidate. He's going to be worse. Some kind of choice election. So in 2020 might be a choice election or referendum election. I think that has a lot to do with any prospect that Trump is going to be reelected or not. And the final quick question is who's going to win? I'm always asked this question in Korea, but now I'm enjoying my chance to ask somebody else this question. So that is some sort of follow-up questions. And here are some other broad issues I would like to talk about as well, just briefly. As Professor Wilcox has mentioned also about the ongoing pandemic situation. And I noticed somebody has said that history as a reference point is no longer applicable because of this pandemic situation. But if you look at this NPR polling, what I found is pretty much kind of pre-COVID-19 situation. Like very much Democrats hate how the Trump administration is handling the pandemic. The Republicans support the Trump responding to the COVID-19. So if this situation is going to change or not, and I remember Dean Roselle has mentioned about old voters in Florida and the nonpartisans maybe breaking away from Trump. I mean, I think that's a very interesting observation. So the bottom line question, how does the pandemic play out in the era of polarization? And this is kind of going directly to you guys. I found that the great book titled Federalism, is a very short introduction, co-authored by Dean Roselle and Professor Wilcox, published in last year. But what about federalism, polarization, and the pandemic? Everything is complex here. And yesterday, Wisconsin Supreme Court struck down governor's decision of stay at home, but the Milwaukee mayor decided to keep that order in place. So this federalism, polarization, and pandemic, what's going on? And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Obama-Trump voters, if you will. So who are they, and what are they doing, and stuff like that. So I mean, Obama, and Trump. I think this is very interesting electorate, and whose decision will be very critical for the 2020 election as well. And I think this has to do with Professor Wilcox's very kind of gloomy expectation about the 2020 election, which might be a sort of total chaos. So mail-in vote has been increasing over the past some years. So now the by mail is almost 23% is a part of the entire election. But what about? But I know that Trump is not a big fan of mail-in voting, but according to some observation, that is not necessarily. It is not guaranteed that the Democratic Party is very much benefiting from the mail-in voting because of all that complexity and the delay and the ineffective and stuff like that. And what about Wisconsin? The upper left electoral college prediction, according to the 27towin.com, my favorite website, if Trump is keeping Wisconsin, even though he's going to lose Michigan, Pennsylvania, then the electoral college result will be 270 versus 268. Trump win. So Wisconsin is a very important state, but at the same time, upper right data is showing that the black death is almost twice as white death in the city of Milwaukee and the Milwaukee County. So mail-in voting and Wisconsin and black voters. And this is final question I have because I'm a student of US Congress and foreign policy. This is a bill introduced by the freshman senator, Josh Hawley of Missouri. The title is Justice for Victims of COVID-19 Act. So this is kind of allowing the US citizens to file a suit against the Chinese government, stuff like that, and even allowing courts to freeze Chinese government assets in the United States so victims can enforce their claims. So my question is, in a normal time, as Professor Wilcox mentioned, this kind of bill is going to be just a position-taking bill. It's going to go nowhere. But in this situation, what do you think is the chance of this type of bill? Not only this bill, but the other bill introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham yesterday, COVID-19 Accountability Act. So what are the chances of this type of bills going in the U.S. Congress? So that's it. So that's my sort of discussion points, and let me stop my the screen sharing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for your own presentation and questions. And let me first, first give Professor Mark Rozelle the chance to respond. Then, if it's okay to you, I will give also chance to respond to Professor Wilcox. Would that fine for you, Professor Wilcox? Okay, go ahead, Mark Rozelle.
Yeah, I think Clyde and I can do this together, actually, because there are some questions he might have a little better take on than I do, or a different take, and some that I can handle. So let me give a first go here on the issue of the faithless electors. Some states have laws that make it a crime for an elector to the Electoral College to vote any way other than the outcome of the popular vote. Okay, the United States Constitution gives electors discretion as to whether they indeed vote the same as the popular vote of the states. So, maybe Clyde has a different view of the constitutional issue here, I don't know, but it's hard for me to believe that the United States Supreme Court would give deference to the states to punish electors for exercising their discretion when the United States Constitution specifically designed the Electoral College to provide that discretion. So my own view is that the state laws that limit discretion of electors are probably unconstitutional. Is the Republican Party the Trump Party now? I think so. If you look at the data, Republican voters, the Republican component of the electorate, as I showed in a couple of slides, has shrunk somewhat since Mr. Trump's election, but it has become very solidly pro-President Trump. So you see some of the polls of Republican voters upwards of 90% and more supporting this president. So, there are some anti-Trump Republican groups, who want to take back the Republican Party. These tend to be at the elite level. Some well-known commentators and political leaders who don't like the direction of the Republican Party, but they absolutely do not represent very much of the grassroots, the common people sentiment within the Republican Party. They're outliers, quite frankly. So the Republican Party, I think, has very much become the Trump Party right now. And so it's a more narrow party, it's more pro-Trump. But is it Trump's party after he's gone? I don't know the answer to that question. I'd be really interested in what Clyde has to say. I hope it doesn't stay the Trump party after Mr. Trump is gone. I doubt it will, because I don't know who else carries the personal appeal. I said it's almost like a cult-like appeal. Clyde said, using Trump's own famous words, that he said, I can walk down Fifth Avenue of New York City and shoot people, and my supporters will still like me, still support me. That's the almost cult-like following, that's associated with this guy. That's just absolutely extraordinary. So I have to believe that once Mr. Trump no longer is in the picture politically in the United States, there's an opening there for the Republican Party to be captured by different interests who will populate the party. Many of whom have moved away from the Trump Republican Party, particularly many business interests and pro-free trade people. And if a responsible type leader can step forward and capture significant support, I think the Republican Party ultimately can swing back to the traditional Republican Party positions pre-Donald Trump. Is this a referendum election or a choice election? I think it's a referendum election, clearly. Elections with incumbents are primarily about the incumbent, right? Ronald Reagan's famous phrase in 1980, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Just put it out there very bluntly what the election was like, right? Was all about. The famous political scientist V.O. Key has this great line that American voters are rational gods of vengeance and reward. I love that line. Rational gods of vengeance and reward. There's a lot of people who are going to express their vengeance, but the Trump voters, reward, right? So it really comes down to, for the question, who will win, who's more numerous, who gets their people out. In polarized America, Mr. Trump, even if he yet again loses significantly the popular vote as he did in 2016, will win a substantial number of electors to the Electoral College, probably at least 200. Out of the 270 needed are pretty much a lock for him already. And the federalism effect, federalism drives presidential elections because we do our elections state by state, right? And so, some scholars who study demographic changes in the United States have pointed out that, one of the interesting trends is that people are moving to places to be with other people more like themselves, which is enhancing significantly the polarization of the American electorate and the consequence of there being states that are so solidly red or blue, Republican leaning or Democratic leaning, that the election tends to come down to a relatively few states. I'll be interested in what my co-author has to say here, whether federalism is any longer an effective construct and good for the country, 2.5 centuries after its invention, given what we're looking at here. I think it has disenfranchised a huge amount of the American electorate, quite frankly. Consider if you live in a state that's 70%, partisan in one direction, right? Your vote doesn't matter. There's no rational basis for going to the polls on election day, right? A cost-benefit ratio would tell you it's not worth your time and money, to go to the poll and vote, other than it's your civic duty. So 80% of America is living in states where their vote effectively doesn't matter because the state is so strongly leaning Democrat or Republican. I think that's a serious problem for the country right now. Mail-in voting, I still think benefits Democrats, but I'll be interested in what Clyde says. And yeah, China's going to be an issue in this election campaign. Mr. Trump, he doesn't take responsibility for any of his own failings. He never will. And he's trying to project blame now on China for the virus spread. And it's similar to his play in 2016 on issues of globalization and the decline of the manufacturing sector in the United States, to blame it on the other, to blame it on foreign competition, to blame it on unfair trade deals, to blame it on China, Japan, taking advantage of the United States, right? And that can play to some pretty ugly, sentiments within the country as well. So there's going to be a lot of talk about China in this campaign. That's going to be part of the Trump strategy to try to pass blame for the failings of his policies on coronavirus to the other, onto China. So, okay, I'll stop there and see what Clyde says.
Thank you for the response. Professor Woodcox?
Yeah, thank you. So Trump is certainly going to want to blame somebody else, and China seems to be first on his list. The idea that we would be able to go to court and sue China for this is legally silly. And the courts have actually ruled on things like this about suing Iran for an attack that killed an American in Israel. The courts have said that's not permissible. He's also going to blame WHO, he's going to blame whoever, but it's up to Joe Biden to run a campaign that makes it into a referendum. And the way you do that is you get a phrase or you get something that you're going to focus on, because the temptation for Democrats is Trump has done so many things we don't like, right? The spreading racism in the country, the overturning all kinds of environmental laws and standards. But you have to keep it simple. So Ronald Reagan, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Most people, the answer is no. What Bill Clinton did when he ran is he had this big sign in his war room, "It's the economy, stupid." Don't get off on different targets. Stay on a particular target. So is it Trump's party? Well, Polarization says that it's whoever the leader is that is their party. So if Trump is not reelected, then his voters, will probably stay with the Republicans. They may not be as excited about someone other than Trump. Maybe some of the moderates would come back to the party if it's a different kind of candidate. But it's important to understand that the rest of the party is not all that different from Donald Trump. There are many exceptions to this, many moderate governors in Ohio and in Maryland, but Mitch McConnell is certainly a Trump guy down the line. Many of the Republican members of the House, they have spent the last 20 years telling their people to don't trust the media, don't trust the government, which now has become the deep state. So now health officials are the deep state. Don't trust science. One of these big marches in Michigan had a big sign, "Science is fake news." So it's going to be kind of a populist right-wing party unless the moderates can find a way to come back. And I think it's really, really dangerous if they're not able to come back, because we need two responsible parties. So looking at the COVID chart there, look at the very top line, and you see that overall the public is thinking that Trump has not done a good job. Now, given what a disastrous job he's done, it should be not that close. But how could it be leaning so far to he's done a bad job when the Republicans and Democrats are equally polarized? Now, there's two things. First, you see in that figure that the independents are leaning to saying he's done a bad job. But secondly, as Marx pointed out, there's simply fewer Republicans now. A lot of people who used to be Republicans are either independents now or in some cases Democrats. And so, but in terms of the virus, we don't know what will happen next, right? We're going to vote in November. The most likely scenario, you see people crowding into bars, you see people crowding into concert halls, people crowding into beaches, is the virus is really going to explode. But we're really not sure, right? And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. In terms of mail-in ballots, the research shows that no party has an advantage. Would Democrats have an advantage this time? Maybe slightly, because I think the Democrats are more motivated. I think in general, the reason there's not an advantage one way or another is because Republican voters are very committed to voting and very organized and very focused on getting the right paperwork in, and not all Democratic voters have the education level or whatever to be able to do that. But Trump's wrong about that. It's not necessarily going to hurt him. I think that's right. Finally, about federalism, actually, Mark and I have just finished a paper which we've sent off and it's been accepted in a journal about federalism in the time of plague. And what we did was we compared 4 federal systems, which vary on all kinds of dimensions, how centralized they are, how strong the parties are, controlled by a left-wing government or a right-wing government, and so forth. And those countries were Australia, Germany, Canada, and America. And so what you see in Germany and Australia and Canada is a remarkable uniformity across the lander, across the provinces, across the states. The leaders of the countries, regardless of their right-wing or left-wing orientation, regardless of the strength of their parties, were coordinating a rational response to the virus. They're now coordinating a rational relaxation of the lockdown with an eye towards locking down again if the virus takes off. And so what we've seen in America has been absolute chaos. We had some states that didn't lock down at all. We have some states that locked down for a brief time and now have concerts, right, that now have bars open. And then we have some states and some cities that are locked down. And Trump has done his best to create a culture war around this. And so if the virus really doesn't appear a lot in the summer or fall, God willing, I have to hope that's true, but I don't think it's true, then that might work out for Trump, right? Because then he can say, look, all the scientists were wrong, the Democrats were all trying to scare you. But I think in the long run, the more likely scenario is that the virus is really going to explode. We lead the world in cases and deaths, and I think that's going to increase even more. But I think that the American response to this has been the worst of any developed country in the world. And I think that it's not necessarily the fault of federalism. I think it's the fault of a very chaotic and weak president, who basically touts himself when he's on TV instead of talking to the voters, and this polarization, which has led many Republicans to not trust science or anything else. But we do have a collective action problem with 50 states because, Australia, Germany, and Canada have many fewer states. 50 is a big number, and so that makes collective action much more complicated.
Okay, thank you for your kind and detailed answers. And is there any questions from the people in the darkness? No? Okay, we have almost, done this session, I guess. And, we better wrap up here, okay? And thank you for your presentation, your kind responses, and, comprehensive discussion, Professor Jung Won-seo. And we are looking forward to getting together May 28th on another topic, okay? Thank you very much for your participation. Have a good day and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Nice seeing you all.
Nice seeing you.
Take care.